What's new in Java 23 and why should you care about it? Find out from the best leaders and experts who are closely involved in creating these new Java features and the ones who will help you to use them. In today's episode of JEP Explained, we'll cover JEP 467, which is about using Markdown in documentation comments. So, what about it? The JavaDoc comments until now have been coded using HTML and JavaDocs. And with this new feature, you'll also be able to use Markdown to write the JavaDoc comments. But why would you want to do that? One of the reasons is that HTML is no longer popular with developers. Also, Markdown is easier to write, read, and can be easily transformed to HTML. But we all know that the devil lies in the details. So, what are the other benefits and challenges of this feature? What about the design considerations? Let's find out from our speakers today. Get ready to discover what you have been missing all these years. Hi everyone, I'm your host Mala Gupta from JetBrains, and to talk about JEP 467, we have with us today Jonathan Gibbons, owner of this JEP, which is Markdown Documentation Comments, and lead of the Java SE language tools team with Oracle. Hey Jonathan, a pleasure to have you with us today.
Hello, I'm pleased to be here.
And we also have with us Dmitry, Senior Architect with BellSoft, also OpenJDK contributor. Hey Dmitry, lovely to have you with us today.
Hi Mama, hi John, hi everyone, glad to be here.
And it's such a pleasure to be talking with both of you today. And I'm sure everyone who's listening to this interview today, they will have a lot to learn. So, Jonathan, I want to ask you first before we talk about the JEP. So, what have been the focus of your work at Oracle? Is it tools or is it language?
It's more tools than language. I would say it's tools and testing and quality. And that is not just testing the quality of the tools, it's writing the tools so that developers can benefit from the features therein.
And Jonathan, since you are the owner of this chip, I wanted to ask you the first obvious question. What is this feature about? Why was it added? Was it to add code snippets to the JavaDoc with ease, or are we talking about something else?
You alluded to the answer in your introduction. It's that HTML is not as popular as it used to be. It is clunky. It has relatively high overhead for relatively simple constructions. And meanwhile, since JavaDoc started, HTML has gotten more complicated and Markdown has gotten more popular. So we wanted to see if we could leverage the ability to write in a popular, modern, simple markup language.
And was it for any particular reason, like adding, let's say, code snippets to the JavaDoc, or is, as you said, it's more about catering to the modern Markdown language?
I wouldn't call out snippets in particular. Kind of what I would say is that it's a way of using more popular constructions for many tags. So people want to use simple font changes in their documentation, like bold font or italic font. And you can do that in HTML, but you can do it in a much cleaner way in Markdown. Um, uh, to address snippets, the JavaDoc doc comment specification does have a snippet tag, but it's it's different to it's maybe not what most people want in the sense of people see code spans and code blocks in Markdown. That's very simple. The snippet tag exists and is slightly has a different set of features.
Right. And as you said, it's more about using the new Markdown. I think the old developers like us, we would still. So I learned HTML when I was in college. So I'm kind of more comfortable writing the HTML code snippets rather than using Markdown. So I think, as you said, it's more catered to the new developers. And with that, Dimitri, I want to ask you, as a developer, how often do you refer to the JavaDoc comments in, let's say, core Java APIs or other libraries? And with this question, what I'm trying to understand is how often developers like us actually use JavaDoc documentation.
Well, it really happens constantly. So all the time, uh, you look at some code, for example, and you don't fall into it. You just study what's written about this method or class, and you understand what it means. And ID will show you nicely all the pretty well formatted information. But that's not the only scenario. We also look at them as plain text. We go there, sometimes we refer GitHub code, or we simply look into that files. And also, we not just read Java docs, but we also read Markdowns, in both forms, in text form and in HTML generated form. We get used to services like GitHub, where we have pages written and displayed after being processed by some engine that generates HTML for us. And of course, there's a very important source of truth, JavaDoc for the standard library as a separate web place where you can point, where you can refer to. That's important, and that's an everyday, not daily task. If you program something, you refer JavaDocs constantly.
That makes sense. That's a good place to understand how any class or library framework is being used or it's supposed to be used. And as you said, the tooling can display the JavaDoc documentation, but also you look at the same on GitHub where you do not have the benefits of the tooling. And on that note, John, I want to ask you another question before we deep dive into the details of this JEP. At the face of it, I believe a lot of developers would say, this is just Markdown. But I understand otherwise because of the conversation that we had. So my question is, why is this not just Markdown?
I would rephrase the question a little bit because your setup is exactly correct. I want people to look at, I want developers to look at this and say, yeah, this is just Markdown. Kind of why do we need a blog entry here? So rather than list all the things that you can do in Markdown in JavaDoc comments, I think it is interesting to focus on just the differences. What we can focus on why is this not just Markdown, and maybe we can get to that later.
Mm, right, that makes sense. John, as the owner of this JEP, I also want to understand from you, who do you think is the target audience of this JEP? Are we talking about library or framework developers, or are we talking about all Java developers?
Um, to a first approximation, we're talking about all developers. It's certainly, the feature is interesting in the context of making Java more approachable to all developers and new developers. There's a term that we use in the OpenJDK design community about simplifying the on-ramp to Java. And writing documentation comments is seen as a big deal hurdle for many people. So if we can give them the ability to write their documentation comments in Markdown, that makes it easier for more people to write the comments. what I would say is that Markdown, as good as Markdown is, it does have its limitations. And so if you are writing something like the Java SE documentation, which is sophisticated and complicated and detailed and has tables and that sort of thing, then maybe Markdown is not the right solution for you. But it's only for those high-end advanced documentation where you might choose not to use Markdown. Otherwise, Markdown is for you.
Dmitry, I want to know your opinion on the similar question. So, because in the previous question, I asked you how often do you read the JavaDoc comments, and now I want to ask you how often do you write JavaDoc comments, and do you think this feature is more relevant for library or framework developers, or for all developers, assuming that we all use IDEs to code? Um, Okay, so this is another question. First, I want to get your opinion on the target audience. What do you think? Because your opinion could be different from Jonathan's.
Well, again, we often write Java docs to especially or correct Java docs for existing code or write Java docs for a new code when the method or a data structure isn't trivial. Most likely it requires some words, but not only texts. We need to present what happens inside in a nice manner. Yes, sometimes we need complicated formatting, though it's great to have that feature. And I'm happy that we have it. But it's a low-level stuff sometimes. And we definitely, and I personally hate to write HTML by hand, especially as if it's additionally escaped HTML sometimes, right? So it's not convenient. Uh, besides writing Java docs for methods, we write other documentation because we have design documents. Maybe we have some longer examples that we wish to break by pieces. And by the way, I percept this movement as a continuation of a great feature of having code snippets that we had in JDK 18. And just some experience to share. My colleague introduced new methods in net address creation. And the amount of documentation there was much larger than the amount of business logic code. Because you need to carefully explain the usages of the method, of how it works, how it can be applied for different tasks. That's where code snippets played a great role. It's very convenient tool, but in that case, the new Markdown feature wasn't used. I wish it could be used there. So I think it's also Java 23, and that's an example from life. We need it.
So that's good. That means that yes, this feature is for all Java developers, and I guess we are happy to use this more than not. So, John, my next question to you is, since when this feature has been in works? I noticed a thread on the mailing list, which I think was from Jan 2021. That was a draft JEP for upcoming work on snippets.
Yes, that was, to use a phrase, the beginning of the end of the story. That the original idea for this feature dates all the way back to JDK 9, when there was a lot of new documentation being written for the Java platform, and documentation in particular for the module system. And when writing huge amounts of documentation, the pain of writing HTML becomes more apparent. And so we had some initial attempts to integrate Markdown into documentation comments as far back as JDK 9. But as with many Java features, it's often a long walk to get from the starting point to the simple endpoint, where you have to visit all the complicated solutions that you don't want along the way. So yes, the actual JEP itself has been around for January 21, it seems you say. We've had a lot of feedback from then, and we've refined it now down to something where, to a first approximation, it's just Markdown.
That's an interesting statement. And before I ask more questions about the details of the step, I want to ask you: are you using, because the Jeff mentioned this, so are you using a variant of Markdown comments for this feature, which is Common Mark variant? And what if developers use other variants? I mean, does this mention is for developers, or is it more for tool vendors, let's say like us, who create IntelliJ idea, and we kind of help in rendering that Markdown comments?
It's for both those audiences that you describe.
Mhm.
We were One of the problems with Markdown is that as soon as you say we're using Markdown, people will say which flavor of Markdown. And in the OpenJDK community, or in JDK code itself, we routinely work with at least 3 different variants of Markdown. There's Common Mark, there's Pandoc, and there's GitHub flavored Markdown. And they're all slightly different. So why did we go with Common Mark? Well, a really important feature of the Java ecosystem in general is the quality of the specifications. And the big feature of Common Mark is that it was developed a few years back as an attempt to come up with a standard version of Markdown. And in particular, it attempts to formally specify the constructions that previously, like if you go to the original Daring Fireball site, the features there were effectively described in terms of regular expressions and not particularly formally, and it was also somewhat inconsistent. So Common Mark was used because it has a formal spec. Even better than the spec, it has a test suite, a conformance test suite, so that you can check implementations. And the final big reason is that there was a Java implementation of the Common Mark spec that was open source and that we could leverage without change.
So, Dimitri, I want to ask you, because you mentioned that you have been using Markdown for your code bases, and you also mentioned that you use it in the other applications. So, what John just mentioned about the variant, does that affect you? How do you kind of work around that? So my question is, how often the variants of Markdown do you consider that one?
Well, it plays its role, and you use a variant that will be processed by the tooling on the other side if there's a tooling, or you choose the more convenient one. But yeah, definitely having a common ground, having a spec is convenient.
And John, I want to circle back to one of the questions that I asked earlier, which was why not just Markdown? So, what are the differences to Markdown? Are we talking about extended links or the headings or JavaDoc tags here?
Um, well, the general goal, if you take the initial goal as being we want to use Markdown in documentation comments, there was at some level a secondary goal of minimize the amount of HTML or JavaDoc tags that you kind of want to use, because they are both HTML at least is publicly known and publicly specified, even though it's old-fashioned. JavaDoc tags, we do specify them formally within the JDK documentation, but it's still a very domain-specific language that people grumble about having to use. So one of the biggest features that we put into this is, without changing the syntax of Markdown, we managed to extend the semantics of what Common Mark calls reference links. And this is where you can put the target of a link in square brackets, and then you can define the link elsewhere. And we've changed, or we've upgraded it so that if there's no formal definition of the reference link, we will look at all program elements that have been declared. So if you want to create a reference to Java-Lang string, for example, all you have to do is put the word string in square brackets. You can get away with string just because that's in the Java-Lang package, which is automatically imported. If you want to refer to your own types, you can either use fully qualified names, or you can use an import and a simple name. So links in general are almost overwhelmingly the most popular JavaDoc tag. And we surveyed a whole bunch of documentation to see how often the different tags were used, and link and link plain JavaDoc tags were right up there. And so finding a home for them in Markdown was really good. As I said, the syntax is still just Markdown, but we've improved the semantics a little bit. You also mentioned headings. Here we do support, without change, standard Markdown SEATX headings. The difference that I wanted to bring out here is that there's actually a change in policy to the HTML headings. And if you're writing documentation documentation comments in HTML, then we recommend that for historical compatibility reasons, that people start headings in the documentation for a class at level 2 and for a method or other member at level 4. That's not particularly convenient or memorable in Markdown, and in particular, some of the headings only support 2 levels of heading. So the difference in policy in Markdown comments is that we took the opportunity to say that the top level of heading in any comment is a level 1 heading, then the next level is level 2 headings, and then JavaDoc will automatically adjust that to the correct level in the generated documentation. And finally, you mentioned JavaDoc tags. And I was saying just now how we've managed to replace the use of the link or link plain tag with just standard reference links. But the fact is, we can't replace all JavaDoc tags with equivalent Markdown. There's just no obvious mapping that we could leverage. So you can still use JavaDoc tags just like you used to. That applies to essentially all tags without exception, whether they're inline tags or block tags. Although most inline tags, most of the standard inline tags, you will not need anymore. So link and link plain, there's code. To get rid of code inline tag, you can use backticks, that sort of thing. The one thing that's notable here is that we do fight a little bit with the Common Mark syntax, because Common Mark says you can't have blank lines in inline elements, and we have JavaDoc inline tags like snippet, which span multiple lines and contain blank lines. So the easy rule here is that if it looks like an inline tag, or if it looks like a JavaDoc tag, then for the most part, it is a JavaDoc tag and is used exactly the same way as before. But that being said, we do take extreme care not to recognize as the @ character as a special character. If you're inside Markdown and you use a code span using backticks, or you use a fenced code block or an indented code block, then those constructs enclose literal text. And it's really important that we don't detect the @ character there. And the particularly common use case that we've always been battling with is annotations, where the conventional program style is to begin an annotation on a line ahead of the method declaration. It looks a lot like a block tag syntactically, and so we have to make sure that block tags are only recognized where they should be. There you are.
Wow, that's so interesting. So many points, and now I'm kind of getting to understand why this is not just Markdown, and so many changes under the hood. And also, it's amazing to kind of see that developers can still use the old Java tags. So this is great as well, because, as you said, it's not easy or even feasible to convert all of them to Markdown. So, John, the next question that I want to ask is, what are the things to watch if we are looking at converting the comments?
It would be, well, one of the many places we went through when we were looking at doing this was, can we not just treat all existing comments as Markdown? And we did some experiments with this, and that helped us identify differences in the generated text, or differences where reading the documentation comment has different effects if you read it as HTML or Markdown. The most obvious and notable one is the treatment of horizontal and vertical white space in comments, that there is a programming style in HTML comments where people write separate sentences separated by blank lines, knowing that they will be coalesced into a single paragraph in the output. And they do this for reasons of readability when you're reading and editing the comment in the source code. So in Markdown, a blank line means a paragraph break. So that's an issue. Horizontal white space is also an issue. We did come across some cases in the JDK documentation where people were writing an HTML list with a UL tag and indented LI tags. And the formatting in this case was that the list items were heavily indented and had blank lines before and after. And they got interpreted as indented code blocks, which was obviously not what the author intended. The other thing to watch for when converting code is that if you started writing complex HTML, by which I mostly mean complicated tables, they don't translate really well into Markdown. Yes, Markdown, all variants of Markdown have some ability to embed HTML in the Markdown, but there are a lot of not so subtle rules about how to embed HTML in Markdown. As another piece of the work we did for the feature, we looked at automatically converting a number of representative classes in JDK from HTML style comments to Markdown style comments. And even though we verified that our translation was accurate by comparing the documentation before and after, it became clear that this doesn't look better to write it in Markdown. So at some level, you could say Markdown does have a high watermark where kind of, if you start using really complicated HTML, maybe think about not converting it. And as a stylistic measure, I would say it will be up to programmers to decide how much they want to convert existing comments. I mean, if you've got existing documentation that works and is correct, by all means leave it. A really important part of this work is that we're not taking away the old stuff. So if you've got comments that work, stay with them. But if you're writing new code, then kind of Markdown becomes a natural alternative.
That makes a lot of sense. If the code, the existing documentation is already good and working, why to convert that to the new format? Because that could have issues. So that's a very good pointer. And before I ask for the closing comments, John, this is the last question. So what are the future plans on this feature? Because I see that this is already a production ready feature, which means developers can use it without having any doubts about something's gonna change with this feature if they use it now.
Yes, the preview mechanism does not extend to tools like JavaDoc. So it did mean we had to get more right up front, and that's part of the reason why it's been in development for quite so long. In terms of future plans, one of the future plans that was in an early version of the JEP was the improved support for headings that I described earlier. So some future plans have already happened. There are more future plans, but I would throw this out there as a maybe, maybe not. We could come up with Markdown coding patterns to replace more tags, and kind of looking at documentation comments in other languages. You could leverage for something like a param or return JavaDoc tag, you could leverage Markdown headings, and we could pattern match over more of the Markdown and say, oh, the user is obviously trying to document the parameters for a method or the return type or the throws list of exceptions that are thrown. So we could model that with headings and lists. But as we experimented with that, although it's nice to see more Markdown, it actually is more verbose, which is an uncharacteristic thing to say about Markdown. The other thing that has come up in more recent times, and this ties back to your earlier question about variants of Markdown, one of the things I miss most in Common Mark is support for a definition list. This is something that does exist in Pandoc Markdown. It does have support for a relatively standard definition list. It's not in GitHub Markdown, unfortunately. But one of the features of the work is that we do use an embedded copy of the Common Mark Java implementation, and currently we use it without change. I would like to keep it that way. But what is interesting about that particular implementation, it too has extension points. And so one possibility down the road is that we could work with the Common Mark project to come up with an extension for definition lists and support that in JavaDoc. And again, if we do that correctly in the context of the Common Mark Java implementation, that's something I would expect us to try and share so that other people who are also processing Markdown documentation comments would be able to see and follow as well.
Wow, that's interesting and a lot of information to kind of sink in. So, Dimitri, on that note, considering that you heard about the current JEP and the future plans, so any closing thoughts that you have for this JEP?
Well, I think existing libraries might need some cleanups. Like there was a cleanup in the standard library, and that will probably happen in many libraries. But afterwards, it should be a thing that will stay for many years, stay with us. Like next 30 years, okay, specified Markdown format, and that's probably the recommendation for developers as soon as it will be released. Just if you need some formatting, if you need some structure in your JavaDoc, first use Markdown. If it's not sufficient, then go to HTML. Just start with a simpler thing.
So Jonathan, closing comments from you. It was absolutely wonderful to hear all that you shared, because normally when we read the JEPs, those stories don't come kind of, even though they might be inside the document, but they don't kind of stand out. So it was absolutely amazing to hear all that from you. So closing thoughts from you.
My primary closing thought is directed at anyone who works on documentation. And even before Markdown existed, I would have given this closing thought to anyone writing documentation, and that is check the output. There have been some funny, if it weren't so tragic, examples in the past where people have written bad HTML such that it sort of looks okay if you're reading the source code or if you're reviewing the source code. But we've seen paragraphs of text lost in the JDK API documentation because, like, for example, someone forgot the closing tag of an HTML link. It continues to be a problem that people don't review their documentation as the end user will see it. One of the ways we've addressed this for JavaDoc in general in the past has been the doclint feature, and also over in the code tools world, we also have some tooling called doccheck. So it is useful having tooling to check the generated documentation. Now, all that being said, one of the less positive aspects of Markdown and Common Mark in particular is there are no error messages for bad Common Mark text. Because there is no bad Common Mark text. It's a sentence very early on in the Common Mark specification that every sequence of characters is a legal Common Mark program. What this effectively means is that, let's say you're writing code and you forget a backtick, or you're writing link and you forget a square bracket. If Markdown doesn't recognize it as a construct, then it is just presented as literal text. So JavaDoc is not going to be able to pick up on what previously would have been simple syntactic errors. So it does become more important than ever for people to generate any documentation they write. And one thing that I look to JetBrains and others is to recommend people use the IDE support for these comments, because writing Markdown, when people write Markdown today, they're typically doing it in editors, and they often have some form of preview mechanism, and it's either like a side-by-side preview, or it's like what I call tabbed preview, which is what you see in GitHub. So I do encourage for anyone who wants to embark into using Markdown comments to work in the context of an IDE and to preview the results even without having to run JavaDoc. Of course, you should still run JavaDoc as well, and JavaDoc will kind of make sure to take any extra tags and the like into account. But check your generated documentation. That's my final thought.
Thank you so much for that point. And on that note, I would also like to quickly show one of the features that we have in IntelliJ IDEA. And as you mentioned, developers should check what the final documentation would look like to the developers, and if they're missing any opening or closing tags. And this is the documentation that I have. So in IntelliJ IDEA, you can change how the your code is rendered. You can toggle the rendered view. So I can click on this one, and this is how I would see the Markdown comments now. Similarly, I could switch between reading the documentation as how they would appear to a developer, or I could switch them back to the Markdown. And this applies to both documentation written using HTML, JavaDocs, Java tags, and Markdown. So this is how they could do that. So and we do have a lot of other support as well in the IDE, and we would share that with the viewers. And with that, we are uh, done with the serious things, serious questions, and now we have two fun sections for both of you. So Dimitri is already loving it. So Dimitri, the first one is tongue twister. So we'll start with Dimitri, and let me show the tongue twister to Dimitri first. And so this is the tongue twister for you, Dimitri, and you have to read it in your regular reading speed. You cannot read it slowly. And I hope you trip on it because no speaker has. And I did not manage to create a tough enough tongue twister for any speaker to trip on it. So fingers crossed. And your time
Uh,
your time starts now.
HTML header tags have hazardous hypertext hashings, haphazardly hashed with hashtags, while Markdown mutates into malformed metadata amid multi-layered markup mishmashes.
You aced it, Dimitri. It seemed that you would. Oh my God. I think that was all kind of to help to show that you would not be able to do that. But you did that. So, Jonathan, on to you now. So, this is your tongue twister. You have to read that at your regular reading speed. You cannot read that slow. And your time starts now.
JavaDoc juggles jargon, juxtaposing Java junctures with judiciously jerry-rigged HTML header tags, while Markdown mishmashes mystifying metadata, managing minor miscalculations in manifold macros.
Oh my God. So, Jonathan aced it too. So, what do I do? This is the last step interview that I'm having recording. Probably I'll try to create more harder tongue twisters in the next series. Thank you both of you for being such sports. And the next section is about, I would show to you three statements and you have to react to those statements. The section is called enacting the emojis. So you have to react to the statements using emojis which cannot be typed out. You have to act them out. So are you ready for the first one? Yes. Okay. And on that note, so this is the first one. Java 23 is about to be released. Yes. So that was a good one. And this is the second one. Implementing language changes in Java. I love the reaction by both of you. It's like, oh my God, yes, it's no big deal. It's you just kind of lose your sleep and you go kind of crazy and a lot of other things and no big deal. And the last one coming your way is holidays and relaxation is equal to hiking in the mountains. Oh my God. So Jonathan is already off to his hiking and Dimitri loves it. Thank you so much. And I think that means you both like hiking in the mountains.
That's a good thing.
Yes. So what was the last one that you hiked? Uh,
Certainly for me, it was Cloud's Rest in Yosemite. It's my happy place.
wow. Dimitri, for you?
Yes, I'm hiking Almaty.
Okay.
Project.
So I guess I'm the only one not a big fan of hiking. So sorry about that. And on that note, thank you so much, both of you. It was a pleasure to talk with both of you and learn about this step and this feature. Thank you so much, Dmitry, and thank you so much, Jonathan. I'm very sure everyone who's watching, who will watch this interview, they will learn a lot about the feature and they would know how to use that the feature correctly. So thank you once again, and thanks for
Thank you,
your
Mama.
time.
Thank you.
Thank you.